Opening the center, this establishes initial central pawn control and offers immediate attacking possibilities. Developing the knight to f6 immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares for a dynamic kingside presence. Developing the knight to f3 supports the central pawn and prepares for kingside castling, maintaining flexibility. Embracing the fianchetto sets up long-term diagonal pressure and prepares a flexible pawn structure. Reinforcing the center's dominion and preparing for a central pawn thrust, this move asserts white's ambition for space and initiative. Developing the bishop to its natural diagonal immediately challenges white's queenside pawn structure and prepares for kingside castling. Reinforcing the central pawn and developing another knight, this move solidifies white's influence across the board. Completing castling establishes a secure haven for the monarch, preparing the king's rook for active deployment across the center files. Seizing central territory, this push dramatically opens lines and challenges black's flank development. Solidifying the center and preparing to unleash the bishop's diagonal power, d6 offers a robust pawn structure for black. Developing the bishop to a square that supports the pawn chain and prepares for kingside castling solidifies white's central control beautifully. Challenging the center directly, black gambits pawn control for dynamic piece activity and open lines. Securing the center's pawn chain, this bishop prepares to join the queenside expansion, adding pressure. A freeing maneuver, resolving central tension and opening lines for the light-squared bishop. Recapturing the pawn reasserts central influence, preparing for queenside expansion and potentially targeting the weak d6 pawn. Reclaiming the e-file with the rook signals intent to contest central control and prepare for potential d-pawn advances. Solidifying the center, this move prepares for kingside expansion while carefully avoiding immediate king exposure. Solidifying the central pawn chain with c6 prepares for queenside expansion and supports the d5 square, a key battleground. Unleashing the queen here aims to secure the e4 pawn and coordinate an offensive thrust. Unleashing a central pawn thrust to disrupt white's development and potentially open lines for attack. Opening the e-file offers directness but sacrifices a pawn for initiative. The pressure on black's queenside is now paramount. Recapturing opens a vital diagonal for your queen and pawn center, seizing the initiative. Castling unlocks the rook, aiming for central control and preparing for pawn advances on the kingside. Developing the knight to d7 prepares to challenge white's central control and offers options for either a knight trade or repositioning for defense. Securing the central d-file and preparing a potential kingside advance, this solidifies white's presence. Unleashing the knight to a more active central outpost, the nb6 prepares to contest white's d-file influence and supports potential pawn pushes like b5. Challenging black's knight immediately creates a dynamic imbalance and probes weaknesses on the queenside. This audacious knight insertion disrupts white's pawn chain, aiming to exploit the open c-file and challenge central control. Recapturing the bishop opens up the d-file, creating immediate pressure on black's central pawn structure and potentially liberating white's rook. Liberating the bishop, this pawn thrust opens diagonal play but exposes your queen and knight. Shielding the king's advance, this secures the central pawn structure and prepares to contest the open d-file. A subtle maneuver, aiming to untangle the queenside and potentially redeploy the queen to a more active square, while preparing to challenge white's central space. Reclaiming the central file with the rook significantly bolsters white's queenside pawn push potential. Pushing that a pawn aims to disrupt white's queenside space and potentially open lines for the rook. Unleashing a bishop to a seemingly active diagonal, white hopes to disrupt black's kingside harmony and potentially exploit weaknesses. Reclaiming central influence and preparing for a knight sortie to the queenside seem to be the primary objectives here. Exchanging the bishop opens lines and simplifies into a position where white's knight on d4 becomes a powerful central outpost. Reclaiming the pawn, black's king now anchors the center, a potential target as open lines beckon. Relinquishing the rook exchange simplifies things, but that king feels exposed and vulnerable on the queen side. Reclaiming the queen after the exchange reopens lines, aiming to exploit white's potentially exposed king in the center. Repositioning the knight opens lines for attacking the weakened black king, aiming to exploit the light square weaknesses. A timely centralizing maneuver, repositioning the bishop to a more active diagonal and supporting the pawn chain. Pressuring the queen side is the goal now, aiming to exploit that weak pawn and gain space. Reclaiming the d-file with the queen attempts to rebalance the board after white's pressure. Reclaiming central control with the queen can lead to active piece play and pressure on black's slightly vulnerable king. Securing the queen on the open file is paramount before white's rook infiltrates further. Shifts knights towards black's exposed king, aiming to exploit the open central files. A quiet repositioning, the rook on e8 aims to control the open file and potentially support a future pawn push. Reclaiming central space, the knight aims to disrupt black's pawn chain and contest key squares. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and create dynamic play. Opening the king's defenses further risks disaster after this pawn push. Reclaiming central squares and preparing for pawn advances, this repositioning aims to disrupt white's coordination. Simplifying the position strategically, this queen trade initiates an endgame where pawn structure becomes paramount. The rook now finds a more active post on the central file, eyeing potential pawn breaks and supporting its own king. Simplifying to an endgame where your knight has a clear outpost on the king side offers a strategic advantage.